Appreciate it. Great to be here tonight. Tonight we are going to be talking about habit-forming products. Can you hear me okay, by the way? You hear me okay in the back? All right, terrific. So if there's one thing we know about these devices that we use every day, is that they have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives. These products change our behavior. And so what I've done over the past several years is to look at what patterns we can find repeated in these products so that we can build better products, so that we can design better products and services for our customers and users to interact with every day. One of the first patterns I noticed when I started studying these companies is that they follow this pattern of first starting out as these toys, these nice-to-haves. And GitHub and Stack Overflow, these companies that are touching hundreds of millions of users' lives and changing profoundly users' day-to-day habits in a relatively short period of time. How do they do that? Well, I codified the patterns that I found inside this book, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which was just published a couple weeks ago. And I started this exploration by first defining what we're talking about here. What are these habits that we find in our day-to-day life? To make sure we're all on the same page, a habit is defined as a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. About 40% of what you do every day, day in and day out, is done purely out of habit, behaviors that we do with little or no conscious thought. And I believe that we are on the precipice of an age where we can use the psychology of habit design for good, where we can help people live happier, healthier, more connected lives by understanding this deeper psychology around why people do the things they do. And I'm not alone in this opinion. That there is an explosion of companies today, many right here in Silicon Valley, that are building products with this deeper psychology of habits in mind in order to help people live better. And that's, of course, what I want to help you do today. So I have to give you one word of warning that the book is 250 pages long. I teach a class at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford and at the Design School at Stanford that's about 3 weeks long. But I've got about 20, 30 minutes here that I'm going to condense a lot of information into a very short period of time. But this is meant to be an overview. This is meant to kind of give you the 30,000-foot view of this model in my work so that it can pique your interest and so that you can go explore more. Okay, so it's going to go by a little fast, but there's a lot more resources. So here's the pattern. Here's what we find repeated time and time again in all sorts of habit-forming products. It's called the hook. The hook is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Now, not every business requires a habit. There are plenty of businesses out there that do a fantastic job of creating and delivering value to their customers without forming a habit. If you're working on the kind of product that's bought once, that's bought through a committee perhaps, that requires a lot of conscious thought, right? A committee's decision-making process is the antithesis of a habit. It's done with a lot of conscious thought, not something that's done with very little conscious thought. However, if you're building the kind of product or service that requires unprompted user engagement, it requires users picking up their devices, checking their apps, checking your website on their own, unprompted, without paying for expensive advertising or spammy messaging, if that's the kind of company you're running, just like those companies I mentioned before, Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram, or even in the enterprise space, several companies like this exist as well, if you're building a habit, you need to build a hook. This is the fundamental pattern we see repeated time and time again. These hooks have 4 parts: a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. So allow me to introduce you to these 4 parts very briefly. Every habit-forming product starts with a trigger. A trigger is a cue to action. It tells the user what to do next. And these triggers come in 2 types, 2 flavors, if you will. We have external triggers and we have internal triggers. External triggers, you'll be very familiar with. We in the product development community know all about external triggers. These are things that tell the user what to do next, where the information is in the trigger itself. So click here, buy now, tweet this, play this. In the physical world, it might be a police officer telling you which way to go in traffic. It could be a friend telling you about this great new app they just downloaded. All examples of external triggers. So product people know all about external triggers. We see them in our environment every day. But what I think product people don't consider enough, and what turns out to be absolutely critical for forming these long-term habits, are the internal triggers. Internal triggers are things that tell us what to do, but the information for what to do next is not contained in the trigger, but instead informed through an association in the user's mind. So what we do in response to being in a certain place, a certain situation, a certain routine, around certain people, and most frequently when we experience a certain emotion, dictates what we do next, dictates the technologies we turn to. And not just any emotion. Turns out the most frequent internal triggers are cued by negative emotions. What we do when we're feeling bored, or lonesome, or lost, or indecisive, or fearful, what we do when we experience these negative emotions, these pain points, dictates the solution we look for. And many times these solutions are found by the technologies in our pockets. Some of the evidence that shows this is the case comes to us from a study that found that people suffering from depression check email more. Now that's kind of a head scratcher, right? Think about that for a minute. Why would people suffering from depression check email more? Well, it turns out that the study found that people suffering from clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the general population. And what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state? They're turning to their technologies. They're checking email more frequently than the rest of the population. And of course, we all do this to some degree. What website do people check when they're feeling lonely? Where do we go? Facebook, of course. What about when we're unsure of something? We're feeling uncertainty. Before we scan our brains to see if we know the answer, what do? We Google it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project you don't feel like working on. Where do you go? Go to YouTube, Reddit, stock prices, sports scores, fashion magazines, Pinterest. Lots of solutions for this internal trigger of boredom. We don't like this negative valence state. It feels bad. And so we seek to be taken out of that emotional state. So what do we do with this? How do we build better products and services knowing the critical importance of these internal triggers? Well, it comes down to fundamentally understanding your user's itch. If you're building a product that necessitates a habit to create and deliver value for your customers, you have to understand its purpose, it's the value prop, not just on a functional level. And we in the product development community, engineers, they love to think about just the functional requirements, but I advocate for not only understanding those requirements, but also the psychological requirements of your product. What are you fulfilling on a psychological level for your customer? What itch are you scratching with enough frequency to form a habit? Absolutely critical to understand that part of your hook. So I wish we had more time to focus on internal triggers. Let's keep going here with a quick case study. I'm going to illustrate the point here for you. How many of you use Instagram? Who here uses Instagram? Anybody? Okay, good. A lot of folks. Terrific. What made Instagram such a habit-forming product? Well, let's talk about Instagram's external triggers first. How did most people first hear about Instagram? And now you start getting notifications. Those are all examples of external triggers. Let's talk about the internal triggers for a moment. Did you say, sir, that you use Instagram?
Yes.
What's your name?
Mike.
Mike, do you remember the last thing you took a picture of with Instagram?
No.
You don't remember? Who uses Instagram frequently to remember what did you take a picture of?
I can find out.
Husky, you took a picture of a dog. And what's your name?
My name is Yasser.
Yasser. So I'm guessing that this dog did not say, Yasser, take a picture of me with Instagram. Right? That didn't happen unless it was a really amazing dog. And yet Yasser had this association that he saw this amazing dog. He wanted to capture this moment before it disappears. And without thinking, with little or no conscious thought, the solution to that problem was Instagram. Instagram scratches this itch of this fear of losing this moment in time, this need to capture it before it disappears. By the way, when I talk about this moment in the photography space, what other company comes to mind other company comes to mind when you think of the moment? Kodak, exactly. Does everybody remember the Kodak moment? The Kodak moment, right? It was a huge marketing campaign that Kodak spent 100 years and almost billions of dollars promoting the Kodak moment. Do you remember the commercials they used to run? Many of us were children at the time, but Kodak used to run these commercials on television of the puppy dogs running through the grass and the children who would someday leave the empty nest. And my personal favorite commercial was the one they always had of Grandma blowing out perhaps her last birthday candles. Do you remember these schmaltzy commercials? Right? They were always on. Why did Kodak spend billions of dollars in almost 100 years teaching people about the Kodak moment? Well, they were creating an association in customers' minds that when you see a moment like this, when you fear that that moment's going to disappear into the ether forever, capture it with Kodak. Instagram did the same thing that took Kodak almost 100 years and billions of dollars. They did it in 18 months with 12 people by teaching Instagram users to teach other Instagram users what the Instagram moment was all about. But of course, Instagram does much more than the Kodak camera ever could because Instagram is also a social network. And so the more times we use a product like Instagram, the more we begin to associate its use with other internal triggers. When we're feeling bored or lonely or FOMO. What's FOMO? Fear of missing out. It's actually in the Merriam-Webster dictionary this year. Fear of missing out is a negative valence state. We don't like the sensation that we might be missing out on something. And so the cure for that pain point is found with this app in our pocket. Right? We instantly associate it with this solution to our pain point, to this negative valence state. So that's a bit about, sorry the screen is so light, let's use this screen instead. So that's a little bit about triggers. Let's talk about the action phase of the hook. The action phase is the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. Let me show you some examples of habit-forming products, and I want you to see how simple these actions are. Something as simple as scrolling on Pinterest, just that act of scrolling, or searching on Google, or pushing the play button on YouTube. These very simple actions done in anticipation of a reward. And it turns out that there is actually a formula for predicting the likelihood of these singular behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher at Stanford named B.J. Fogg, and Fogg posits that for any human behavior, think about the power of this, any human behavior can be predicted by this formula. That for any behavior, we require sufficient motivation, sufficient ability is how easy or difficult something is, and a trigger must be present. Who's seen this model before? Anybody? Oh, good. So it's new to almost all of you. Terrific. So let's talk about these three factors. We already talked about triggers. Let's talk about motivation and ability. Motivation is the energy for action. According to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, it's the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. Now, psychologists have been arguing about the nature of motivation for decades and decades, but Fogg gives us these 6 basic levers that we can use to increase the likelihood of someone doing a certain behavior by increasing their motivation, because all of us as human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. We seek hope and avoid fear. We seek social acceptance and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of ad copy you've ever seen, every television commercial, every banner you've ever seen that's trying to boost your motivation is using one or more of these 6 basic elements. A lot more to be said about this as well, but let's move on to the next part of B equals MAT, ability. Ability is the capacity to do a particular behavior, how easy or difficult something is to do. And here again, we have these 6 basic factors, these 6 levers that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur by changing how much time something takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles. This is a big deal when it comes to technology products because it turns out the harder something is to understand, the less likely that behavior is to occur. Social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And then finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. And this is why habits are so powerful. Because the more we do something, the easier it becomes, and therefore we become more likely to do it in the future. What do we call that principle? It's called practice. The more we do it, the easier it becomes, the more likely we are to do it in the future, and this is why habits have this repeater. So Fogg puts on these three factors of motivation, ability, and triggers on this graph that's very useful in a startup development context. As you're building your product, enterprise, consumer, doesn't matter. You're asking yourself, why isn't the user doing the thing we want them to do? Right? You designed this beautiful product. Why isn't your user doing the intended behavior? You can ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? High motivation, low motivation. Does the user have sufficient ability? If something is easy to do, it's way over here. If something is hard to do, it's way over here. And for any human behavior, offline, online, doesn't matter. When we have sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and a trigger is present, the behavior will occur every single time. Let's make this crystal clear. I want you to think of a time in your life when a phone rang and you did not pick up the phone. What's a reason you didn't pick up the phone? Let me hear. You were listening to me. Perfect example. So some of you, I heard a few triggers, right? I heard some beeps and rings just now. Why didn't you answer the call? Well, it's kind of socially deviant. You don't have enough ability to do that. It's too difficult. You have to get up, go through the aisles. See, there's one right there. You'd have to go through the aisles. It's difficult to do. It's kind of hard right now, right? It's hard to get up in the middle. It's socially weird. So you've got this. Maybe you really want to pick up that call. You have high motivation. You heard the trigger, but you lack ability. Too difficult in this given moment in time. What's another reason why you may not pick up the phone? You don't want to pick up the phone because it's an unknown caller, let's say, or it's a telemarketer. It's somebody you don't want to talk to. So even if you heard the phone ring, and the phone is right there next to you, you've got very high ability, very easy to pick up the call. You don't pick up the call because you lack motivation. You don't pass the threshold because you lack motivation. What's one more reason that has to do with the trigger why you may not pick up the phone? You don't hear it. Exactly, the phone's on silent. So think about this. Even if you have plenty of motivation, you really wanted to pick up the call, and even if the phone is right there next to you, you never cross this threshold because the trigger was not present. I can't tell you how many times I'm hired by a company and I go in to see a big expensive design review, and I look at the user flow, and I ask the team, where's the trigger? What do you want the user to do in this case? So for every human behavior, we require sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger every single time. Let's do another case study here. Let's look at Twitter and how Twitter has evolved over the years using this principle of motivation, ability, and triggers. Take a look at the Twitter homepage in 2009. Here's the Twitter homepage in 2010. And here's the Twitter homepage today. What's changed? What do you see that's different when it comes to motivation, ability, and triggers? What do you see?
Easier to use.
Much easier to use, right? I mean, look at 2009, look at Twitter back here, right? All this text. And look at all these triggers. So what was a trigger? It was a button that took you to a different page. Why was a trigger? How was a trigger? Watch a video is a trigger. Sign in is a trigger. Click here is a trigger. Click here is a trigger. And get started, join is a trigger. Whew. That is a ton of cognitive load. That's a ton of thinking the user has to do to figure out what the heck you want them to do. And speaking of, what has always been the intended behavior? What does Twitter always want people to do through the years? What's always been the intended behavior? To sign in or sign up. That's always been what Twitter wants people to do here. And so what Twitter figured out was, by clearing the cognitive clutter, by making it easier for the user to understand the intended behavior of sign in or sign up, they increased conversion, and they could start sending people through their hook. Now, I know what somebody in this room is thinking. Yeah, but in 2009, you're thinking.
It was new.
It was new.
Yeah.
See, I told you I knew what somebody was thinking. In 2009, people needed to be explained, right? You needed to tell people about the product because they didn't understand what Twitter was for, right? Unfortunately, that's wrong. Because when I did my research for the book, talking to the people who actually built this page and watched it evolve over the years, what they discovered was that nobody came to Twitter by mistake. Nobody typed in twitter.com and said, oops, what's this? That never happened. People always came to this page with plenty of motivation. Why? Because they heard about it from their friends. Oprah was talking about it. They heard about it from the media. Some way they had plenty of motivation when they landed on this page. They intended to come to that page. And all Twitter had to do was to capitalize on that high motivation by increasing ability, by making it easier for the user to do the intended behavior. So the lesson here isn't, oh, go create a landing page just like Twitter. That's not the lesson. The lesson is, what can you do in your product flow to make the desired behavior easier to do, to decrease cognitive load, to make that behavior more likely to occur by making it simpler to do. So that's the action phase. Let's move on now to the reward phase, the third step of the hook. When we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. It was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner, who discovered that when they attached electrodes to the brains of lab animals and allowed these lab animals to self-stimulate, they could push this little lever to send this electrical current to this part of the brain. The lab animals did so incessantly. They would click on these buttons hundreds of times. They would forgo food and water. They would run across painful electrified grids just to continue to keep stimulating their nucleus accumbens. In later experiments on people, Olds and Milner observed similar results. And many of their test subjects had to have these machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop activating this part of the brain. Now, it turns out you don't need electrodes to activate the nucleus accumbens, that all sorts of products activate your nucleus accumbens every single day. Things like luxury goods, sex, certain foods, chemicals, and of course, technology. All of these things activate your nucleus accumbens every single day. Now, Olds and Milner in the psychology community believe that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens must be to stimulate pleasure. Right? Why else would lab animals and later people incessantly activate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. It turns out the role of this part of the brain, the way the brain gets us to act, is not by stimulating pleasure per se, but by activating what we call the stress of desire. Because the nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of a reward. But when we actually get the thing we want, the thing that's supposed to make us feel good, the thing that's finally going to make us happy, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So it turns out the way the brain gets us to act is by activating this itch that we seek to scratch. Have you ever felt that nagging pain of, oh, I wonder what's happening on my email or my Twitter account or my Facebook account? You know what I'm talking about. That's this itch we seek to scratch. And it turns out there's a way to supercharge this stress of desire. Anybody want to know how? Anybody curious?
Yes.
I'm doing it to you right now. The unknown is fascinating. So when I took that long pause right now, and I asked you a question with a question mark at the end, some of you perked up. What's he going to do next? Why did he change his cadence? What's happening? And it turns out that this bit of variability, this bit of mystery, is in all sorts of habit-forming products. And of course, this comes from the classic work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you might remember Skinner from your Psych 101 class, the father of operant conditioning, who showed that when he took these pigeons, he put them in a box, he gave them a disc to peck at, and at first, every time they pecked at the disc, they would receive a reward. They would receive a food pellet. And so what Skinner proved was that he could train pigeons to peck at this disc whenever they were hungry. Then Skinner did something a little bit different. Skinner introduced a variable reward. So sometimes the pigeons would peck at the disc, nothing would happen, no food pellet would come out. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeons pecked at this disc, increased. It was observed to occur more frequently when the reward was given on a variable schedule reinforcement. Why does this happen? Because we now know that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, stimulating this wanting, craving reflex. And in all sorts of products that you find most habit-forming, most engaging, the things that capture our attention and won't let go, you will find one or more of these three variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let's walk through these real quick. First comes rewards of the tribe. These are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. Empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good. Partnerships, cooperation, competition, all of these things are examples of variable rewards of the tribe. Best example I can think of online, social media. When you use a product like Facebook, you're never quite sure what you're going to find in your newsfeed. What photos might you find? What do the comments say? How many likes did something get? High degree of variability about what you might find when you check your newsfeed every day. Next comes the search for resources, what I call rewards of the hunt. Rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other resources, and in modern society, we buy these things with money. So when people think of variable rewards, they often think of slot machines, right? We think of gambling games, where the variable reward is what's going to come out of that slot machine, right? There's uncertainty about the reward. But it turns out we see a very similar mechanism online. Think about the news feed for a minute, or this feed mechanism that we see in so many products today. Why do so many products online have this feed mechanic? Let's take Twitter as an example here. So if I'm scrolling through my timeline, that's not very interesting, that's not very interesting, but oh, maybe the third thing is very interesting. And what do I have to do to get more of these information rewards, to find the next interesting tweet? What do I have to do? Just scroll. So this is very similar to this, pulling on a slot machine. Both variable rewards of the hunt. Searching and searching and never done searching around these variable rewards. Finally comes the search for self-achievement, rewards of the self. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. These are things that are intrinsically motivating. Even if we have we're not playing these games with anybody else, even if we're not receiving any kind of rewards, these are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and don't have any of these social or information rewards or material rewards. They're intrinsically motivating. They feel good in and of themselves. The search for mastery, consistency, competency, control, all examples of variable rewards of the self. So gameplay, for example. The motivation behind playing the latest Candy Crush or Farmville or any of these games, it's many parts. Even if you're not playing with anybody else, and even if you're not earning anything by playing these rewards, there's no material reward, there's something fun about getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement, and controlling the experience. All examples of rewards of the self. Now, some of you are probably thinking, yeah, but Nir, I'm not much of a gamer. I don't understand these kids who play these crazy games. I bet you play this game every day. Checking those unread messages, clearing your inbox, finishing the tasks on your to-do list, or when you see that app notification that you just have to open so you can clear it out of your way, all examples of variable rewards of the self. Mastery, consistency, control, and competence. One word of warning. Before you say to yourself, great, we're going to put in all kinds of variable rewards into our product, it's going to be super habit-forming, there's one critical rule that you can't break. And that is that there has to be a connection between the internal trigger and the reward. The variable rewards are not a free pass. That if the internal trigger, if the itch, is boredom, well then the variable reward damn well better entertain. If the internal trigger is loneliness, seeking connection, well then the variable reward has to connect people together. Because fundamentally, the purpose of the variable reward phase is to give the user what they want, to scratch their itch, and have a bit of mystery around what they might find next time they engage with the product. Which brings me to the last step of the hook, the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product, some bit of effort into the product, in anticipation of a future benefit. This isn't about immediate gratification. This is for a future reward. And the purpose of the investment phase is to increase the likelihood of the pass through the hook in the future in two ways. The first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by loading the next trigger. Loading the next trigger. So, for example, on WhatsApp, When I send someone a message on WhatsApp, nothing happens, right? There's no immediate gratification. I don't get any points. I don't get any badges. Nothing happens then and there. But when I send someone a message by using that platform, by investing in that platform, I'm loading the next trigger because I'm likely to get one of these, a reply. And of course, what is that little icon telling me here? That's an external trigger, prompting me to open the app and return through the hook cycle once again. So that's the first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. The other way is by storing value. And this is one of the reasons I love working in technology products. Because unlike things made of atoms, unlike things in the physical world that depreciate with use, that lose value with wear and tear, so think of these tables, these chairs, your phones, your laptops, everything in the physical world depreciates with wear and tear. But habit-forming technologies should do the opposite. Habit-forming products should appreciate with use. They should get better and more valuable the more they're interacted with because of this principle of stored value. It's a very big deal. So for example, when I add content to my iTunes library, I'm storing value as it becomes my one and only music library. The more data I give to a mint.com or any number of sites like Pinterest, the more data I give these sites, the better they become, the more I use them. This is a great example in the enterprise space. A product like Slack, for example. The more data I put into that product, the better it becomes for me. I can do more with that product the more I invest in it. Followers. The more followers I have on Twitter, the better the product becomes as a way for me to reach my audience. So if tomorrow Twitter said, hey, look, Twitter's no longer free, you're going to have to start paying for it now. Who's more likely to send them a check? Someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers. Why? Because they've stored all this value in the site in the form of followers, stored value. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because my reputation on sites like TaskRabbit or Airbnb or eBay determines what I can charge for my goods and services on these platforms. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms after I've invested all this energy in acquiring a positive reputation score? Kind of hard to do, right? I'm unlikely to leave once I've stored all this value in the platform. So that's it. That's the basic introduction to the hook model, these experiences designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that user preferences are shaped, that tastes are formed, and that habits take hold. Now, I warned you that that would be a lot of information. There's a lot more in the book. I tried to make the book very actionable. It's not one of those business books that you read the first chapter and then it's so boring that you can't finish it. I tried to make it something, the kind of book I wanted to read in my last company, a very actionable step-by-step guide for how to build habit-forming products. But I'll give you the cheat sheet here, is answering these 5 fundamental questions that if your business model depends on forming a habit, you have to be able to answer these 5 questions. Number 1, what's your user's itch? What's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts the user to action? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, number 5, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? Now, before I go, there is one more thing I'd like to talk about. And that is the morality of manipulation. And I'm guessing that nervous laughter was because many of you during this presentation were thinking to yourself, is this kosher? Is this okay to do to people, to use their inner psychology to change their behavior? Is that all right to do? And if you had that reaction, bravo. I think that is the appropriate response to this information because let's face it, whenever we are designing experiences, whenever we are changing user behavior to meet our ends in mind, that, my friends, is a form of user manipulation. And we need to be very careful about how we use these practices because the products that we're building here in Silicon Valley are the ones that users take to bed with them every night. The first thing we reach for in the morning before we even say hello to our loved ones. And as Ian Bogos said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So what responsibility do we have as product designers, as innovators, as entrepreneurs and investors? What responsibility do we have to use the psychology of habit design for good? Well, I encourage you to use what you've learned here tonight to help fix one of the world's problems, to engage people in something meaningful and something important, and to use the deeper psychology of habits to help people live happier, healthier, more connected lives by using the psychology of habit design for good. And to paraphrase the words of Gandhi, I encourage you to build the change you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. With that, I'm happy to take some questions. Do we have some time?
When we
Oh, sit down here? Okay, great. So while we do that, I have a quick favor to ask. Can everybody lift their phones in the air for me? Quick favor from you. So I've just made it easier to take the intended behavior. Here's what I want you to do. Go to this URL, www.opinion2.us. Here's the website to go to. Take you about 30 seconds to do this very, very quick survey. I'd love to know what you thought of the presentation. I'm constantly tweaking it based on user feedback. Just a bunch of radio buttons, literally take you 30 seconds. As soon as you click submit, you will be taken to a link to my SlideShare page where you can have all the slides you just saw. You can keep them, share them, do whatever you want with them. That's the reward. Obviously, I'm using my own methods here. And with that, happy to open it up.
Yeah, another round of applause.
Can we move back to the slide, please?
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
We'll leave it on there.
Okay.
So here, I guess the first question is, given that you were a two-time founder already, did you actually use any of these things that you learned, or were these after you did your startups?
So my background before writing the book was I was at a company that was at the intersection of gaming and advertising. And these are two industries that frankly are use mind control to their advantage, right? Advertisers spend a ton of money boosting your user motivation. They use very sophisticated psychological principles to get people to do the things they want them to do. And the same with games. I mean, you know, if you think about social games, they are masters of designing these experiences to get people to do the things they want to do. And so I was at the intersection of these two industries, and I saw a lot of these techniques being used, but what I was surprised about is that there wasn't actually a vocabulary around why these things worked. People just knew they worked because the competitor did it and he was successful, or that company did it and that entrepreneur was successful. And so there wasn't a guidebook for how to use this stuff for good. I mean, what I talk about in the book has been around for a while. It's just been locked up within these companies as a competitive advantage. And so what I want to try and do is to help these entrepreneurs that I was at my last company designing an experience that I thought would really benefit users, but for some reason they weren't being used. The products we were building, for some reason, people weren't engaging with them. And so that's really why I wrote the book. I wrote the book that I was looking for at this company who couldn't find it.
So that's a really good point. So, you know, suppose that people do start using it and implementing some of the things that work, and it still doesn't work. How do you figure out why it's not working?
So let me give the broader context that I do quite a bit of angel investing. And so what I look for in a company, I look for gems. And I don't know who invented this framework. I've kind of adapted it for my own purposes. But the framework for what I look for in a startup company is a gem, G-E-M. Growth, engagement, and monetization. That's kind of the quick and dirty business model. I mean, there's a lot more to a business model, of course. And there's Alex Osterwalder, and there's a lot of people who have defined the components of a business model. But if the quick and dirty analysis of a startup is these three things, I find it works pretty well. So I look for growth, engagement, and monetization. Now, each of those three principles, those three pillars, is necessary but not sufficient. And everything I taught you today was just about engagement. So if you build a product that is super habit forming, and people use it every day, but there's only 10 of those people and you can't figure out how to grow your product, and there's no hope of ever monetizing those people, then you've got to. Right? So you need all three. So this is not magic pixie dust that you pour on your business, make it habit forming, and ta-da, you've got the next Facebook. There's obviously a lot more that goes into a startup. But if you're building the kind of product that requires unprompted engagement, that requires habits, what I wanted to do, the goal was, I was very much into the lean startup movement and customer development as proposed by Eric Ries and Steve Blank. It works wonders. It's a great process, much better than the way we used to build software, just by building a waterfall process and not talking to customers. But the idea behind this was that, as you pass through the build, measure, learn loop that we've all become familiar with around lean startup methodologies, the part we would always get stuck on was the build phase. The measuring and learning, once you set up the infrastructure, that's easy, that's fun. The building part was where the blood, sweat, and tears and money all go, right? The building part is what would take you at least months, sometimes unfortunately years to crank something out. And so if we can look deeper than what customers are able to articulate, there's a lot of things that customers can't tell us drives their behavior, but in fact does, we can build the right thing sooner. And so I propose we look to consumer psychology to understand people's behaviors in a way that they might not be able to actually tell us drives their behavior.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. A lot of the entrepreneurs associated with TIE tend to come from the enterprise, and you alluded a little bit to enterprise talk as well. How do you apply some of these learnings to enterprise applications?
Right. So if, as I mentioned, not every product needs to form a habit. There's plenty of businesses that can create and deliver value to the customers without habits. That's great. That this is really for products that require repeat engagement, that require habits. So if your product is the kind of thing that's sold into a committee, that's bought once and then put on some server farm and nobody ever actually interacts with, you don't need habits, right? That's a one-time behavior. However, if you're building the kind of enterprise product that is used by the frontline worker, right? So think how Salesforce was adopted, or GitHub, or Stack Overflow, or now Slack. These products were first used, they created user habits, they built up enough investment so that over time, the manager said, oh my God, where do I send the check? My whole team is using this product. And so if that's the kind of product you're working on, if it requires frontline adoption and then percolation up the management chain, same rules apply. There's no difference between the hooks, the habits that are created in enterprise versus those that are created in consumer.
And would that apply also to, for example, IT admins? A lot of technologies that we see at TIE are sold to the CIO and the IT team, but somebody has to still implement it. Would that also apply?
It's all about whether it meets this test of a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. It requires a lot of deliberation. If it's an infrequent behavior, no sense in starting it. There's other ways to do it.
What's the level of frequency you're looking for before you can say, yeah, this potentially could be a habit-forming problem?
That's a great question. So I didn't get to talk about it in the presentation, but one of the first chapters in the book talks about this frequency problem. That it turns out that we know that frequency is a very important prerequisite for forming these habits. And it turns out there's a precipitous drop-off in the likelihood of forming a habit. The behavior does not occur within a week's time or less. So for a lot of companies, that's very scary. They don't know how to engage people more frequently. So I spoke at a conference of 700 real estate agents a couple weeks ago. And they brought me in because they wanted to make home buying a habit. Well, that happens once, 5 to 10 years people buy a home, right? That's not a frequent enough occurrence to ever form a habit around. And it requires a ton of conscious thought. So you're never going to form a habit around something that's as difficult cognitively as buying a home. But after I gave this workshop, I didn't know the answer. I didn't know what to tell them about what they should form a habit around. I gave them a 3-hour workshop, and then afterward, they had generated all these ideas. So one agent came up to me and said, look, I'm going to build a product that gets people to engage with me. And she wasn't sure if she was going to do a website or a phone, or I don't know. She didn't know the interface, but she wanted that every time her customers felt this internal trigger of anxiety over money, they would call her or go to her website or check her app, whatever it was that she was going to build. That's the internal trigger that she wanted to attach to, so that through repeat engagement, by forming that association, eventually the net result of all that engagement would be that when the time is right to buy a home, guess who they're going to call? Another agent came up to me and said, well, I'm going to be, whenever you're thinking about, you have this internal trigger of uncertainty about what to do over the weekend in my town, I'm going to be the person you check with. Right? So that's a behavior that occurs within a frequency of a week's time or less. And so they could form a habit, oh, we're going to go to Jack's website or Jack's app or call Jack, whatever it's going to be. I'm not sure of the interface. But that's my guy whenever I have this uncertainty about what's going on in my neighborhood. And of course, who am I going to call when I'm ready to buy or sell my home? Right? Great example of how monetization becomes a result of engagement.
Up to the audience, I'm sure there's a lot of questions just waiting to be asked. So a couple are ready to go up. Nice.
Here again on behalf of everyone, thanks for coming. On the real estate, I do want to say checking the neighborhood, sales, and potential value can become a habit. The question for you is, I'm in the enterprise space with the IoT product I talked to you about. The customers have a habit with all the legacy products. So how do you advise startups that are disrupting it against something which has been do we still need to go through the same, or is there something else we need to do?
Let me just repeat the question because we don't have a third mic, unfortunately, for the audience. The question effectively is, how do you break your competitors' habits so you can insert yourself and create your own habits for that customer?
This is a great question because one of the reasons that it's so attractive to build a habit-forming product, and one of the reasons that the few companies who can do this effectively generate so much economic value, is because habits are a competitive advantage. They're a barrier to entry. When a company has a competitive advantage, when a company has formed a habit with a customer, it's very difficult for a competitor to swoop in and take that customer away. Let me give you an example. Can you raise your hand for me if you search with Google in the past 24 hours? Who searched with Google? Okay, take a look around the room. How many of you have searched with Bing in the past 24 hours? Bing. All right, so we have 2 ex-Microsoft employees here. What's going on? Why is that? Why is overwhelmingly everybody in the room has searched with Google, but only 2 people have searched with Bing? It's because Google's better, right? Google has developed better algorithms, and that's what keeps us coming back, right? Wrong. It turns out if you strip out the branding, that independent studies have shown that if you just show the search results between Google and Bing, people can't tell the difference. Pretty much a 50-50 split. And in fact, did you know that Bing will pay you to search? They have this big, I don't have any affiliation with Microsoft, but they actually give you a reward. They give you these points that you can transfer into real money for searching, but you wouldn't even know that, would you? Because you've created this habit in your mind that when I need an answer for something and I'm feeling this internal trigger of uncertainty, it's always Google that I go to. It's such a huge competitive advantage, this mind monopoly they've created in us, that this is my one and only go-to solution. Which brings me to the cold, hard fact that in technology, it's not always the best product that wins. Sometimes it's the product that's able to form the stickiest habit. Now, so what do? How do you break your competitor's habit so that you can reclaim that habit for yourself and so that you can convert your customers to a better solution? There's only 3 ways to do it that I know of. Tell me if you think of them. The 3 ways are to run users through the hook with greater velocity. Meaning if you're the company that can go trigger action reward investment faster than your competitor, that's one way to win that habit. So if you can make it, typically happens in the action or the investment phase. If you can figure out ways to remove steps, to make the reward come faster, to go through these 4 steps at greater velocity, that's way number 1. Way number 2 is to increase the frequency of passing through the hook. So way number 1 was velocity through the hook. Way number 2 is how often throughout their day, how frequently throughout their day, they experience the hook. So this typically happens when there's an interface change. So when we went from desktop to laptop to mobile and now very soon to wearables, every time there's this interface change, the habit deck gets reshuffled. Why? Because now these devices can be used more frequently throughout our day. So these old habits get reformatted for these new interfaces, and that's where new companies can take on incumbents. The third way that you can steal away a customer's habit is by making the reward more rewarding. So that critical third phase of the hook, the reward phase, if you can do something to scratch the user's itch better, and I'm not just saying a little bit better, but dramatically better. The Harvard Business Review said it has to be 9 times better to switch a customer over. If you can dramatically make the reward more rewarding, there's a chance to do that there as well. One example of this is Snapchat. Everybody's familiar with Snapchat. Mark Zuckerberg offered reportedly $3 billion to buy this silly little messaging app. Now, apparently they raised it a $10 billion valuation. And the reason that Snapchat is keeping Zuckerberg up at night is because the reward is more rewarding. What is it about Snapchat that's special? What makes a Snapchat message different from every other platform? What happens to your message when you send it? It explodes, right? It disappears. So when you send someone a message on Snapchat, not you, it's probably your kids that are using Snapchat. When somebody sends a message on Snapchat, that message disappears, it explodes. So what does that do to the ability curve? Remember we talked about motivation and ability? What does that do to the user's ability to send pictures? Well, they become more likely to send pictures, so they're doing it more frequently, and they're doing it with less discretion. If I post a photo to Facebook, that's going to be around forever. And my parents might see it, and my aunts might see it, and my family might see it. That's embarrassing. But on Snapchat, I know that I can send maybe pictures that are a little bit sillier, a little bit sexually suggestive. I can do things that I wouldn't normally do on Facebook that make the reward more rewarding. So if you receive a message on Snapchat, the exact same moment you receive a message on Facebook, guess which one you're going to open first? It's going to be the Snapchat. It's not going to be the message from Aunt Matilda on Facebook. It's going to be the Snapchat. That's 9 times out of 10 going to be more interesting. The reward is more rewarding. Make sense?
So I have a follow-up question actually. So you said that 2009 Twitter started and put multiple triggers. There was a video and everything. 2011 they just had one sign-in button. But if you think in 2011 people knew what Twitter was. My friends told me, oh, Twitter does this, this, and this. I read it in the news. But in 2009 it just started, so people needed to be educated. So isn't that the video and stuff makes sense?
Yeah. But I talked about it briefly in the presentation. That's actually not correct. Right. What they found was that nobody came to the site by mistake. They had tons of motivation. And so what Twitter found very quickly was that by making the site simpler, they actually increased conversion. It was the exact opposite of what they thought, because nobody actually needed to be educated. What they were trying to do was to boost motivation. And that's actually what you want to do last. What I found when companies try and increase a behavior, they always try to go motivation first. The customer just doesn't understand it. If only we could talk to the customer and make a video and do an instruction manual and tell them and preach to them, then they'll get it. And what I find is much more effective, making sure there's a clear trigger and making the action as easy as possible to do, start people running through the hook so that they understand the experience by actually using it.
Yeah.
And that's what Twitter figured out.
Question down over here.
So
Who's got a mic?
follow on to your M, motivation versus the gem.
Okay.
What does it do to monetization in case of?
Once again?
So you talked about the gem, i.e. monetization.
Growth engagement,
Your big
it's an
M.
acronym. Growth engagement monetization.
Right. So the Snapchat experience, what does it do to their monetization? When they have.
Okay, so you're right. I didn't finish explaining this. So when I invest in a startup, I look for 2 out of the 3, and I plan for the 3rd. So no startup. If you've got all 3, if you've got growth engagement monetization, you're not a startup anymore. You're an established company. You're not searching for a validated business model. You've got a validated business model. So when I invest in a startup, I look for 2 out of the 3 with a plan for the 3rd.
Just to smooth out the Q&A session here, I'm going to point to somebody who's going to ask, bring a mic over to the person, and then the next person as well, so you know where to take the mic next. So you first, and then who after him wants to go. Then we'll send it back that way. The gentleman over there back there.
So I want to extend you from your thinking about this type of products to a different category of products, which are the normal hardware type products. What would you think the role of this thinking will be in that type of activity, and how will any of this will apply for the product development on a startup basis?
Right. So I think what you're asking is, how does all this play out in the hardware space, right? What is wearables and these technologies that are bought up front? So I would say that buying that product, buying that physical artifact is a growth problem. So growth, engagement, monetization. Growth is, how do I onboard a customer? So if there's behaviors that are done once, that's not an engagement challenge, right? Like a registration process, that's not an engagement challenge, that's a growth challenge. It's an onboarding process. So the onboarding process to a hardware product is buying the physical thing and bringing it home. Now, as we've seen in the wearable space, the ugly secret is that even with these products that people pay for, put on their wrists, we know that about 50% of people throw these products away in about 6 months. Terrible. It's a tragedy. It should be it should not be anywhere near that high because if you think about it, the physical manifestation of a product is a trigger, is an external trigger, right? The fact that this product that you've paid for already, that you've already invested in, is sitting there on your kitchen table, you should pick it up and start using it. The problem is that these products have rested on their laurels so much, they have so focused on selling the products as opposed to making them engaging that we see what happens, that people stop using them. And I've got, do you guys want to hear why fitness apps make you fat? Is that interesting? Yeah, I think it explains why these products have failed to date. And why I think they will get better. I think we're at the trough of the hype cycle, and I'm looking forward to seeing us lift out of this trough. But the reason that fitness apps to date have made you fat, and reasons why people don't use them anymore, is that they backfire. They actually do the opposite of what we think they're going to do. So we all know about these fitness products. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but that's what I do. I like to kill sacred cows. So these fitness products that tell us to exercise more and eat less, they do three things fundamentally incorrectly. Number one, they make us fat because they believe that calories in, calories out is the way you lose and gain weight. A lot of science and our basic chemistry tells us that is not the case. Calorie is not a calorie. But to many of these apps, if you eat a calorie of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, or you eat a calorie of protein, that's the same thing. Or if I go exercise for a few minutes, that's the same thing. That's just not true, scientifically. And there's a lot, I'm not going to talk about the science about it. Go read Gary Taub's book, Why We Get Fat. You'll learn all about that. The second reason that these things make us fatter, the reason these products backfire and people stop using them, is that for most people, here I'm going to kill another sacred cow. Most people, exercise is bad for them. If you don't like doing exercise, it's bad for you. And here's why. Because there's a psychological principle of reactance. Reactance dictates that when you feel like you're being good in one area of your life, you allow yourself, subconsciously even, to be bad in other areas. So here's what happens. You work out at the gym, and you sweat, and you suffer, and you're laboring through so that you can meet your points tally of your exercise goal for the day. And then what do we do after we sweat it out at the gym? We go to Jamba Juice and we drink a mango smoothie with 52 grams of sugar and 600 calories. Because we deserve it, we earned it. And even if we don't consciously think of it, it turns out that studies have shown we eat a little bit more here, a little bit more there, it takes an apple and a banana, and now our 30-minute run is gone. Right? The third reason, I think the biggest error the wearables industry has not figured out yet, and what I'm looking for, my hope, the shining hope with this industry, is that to date, the wearables industry, when it comes to fitness products, has been completely extrinsically motivated. Meaning, do it for the points, do it for the badges, do it for the competitive spirit of beating your friends. And that works temporarily. What happens is when you remove those rewards, the behavior stops. Instead, what I'm looking for, I think the next phase of wearables, will be products that help us find the intrinsic pleasure in these behaviors. So physical activity is great, but only if you enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, see reason number 2, the more licensing problem. But if you do enjoy it, physical activity is great for you. So how can technology, and this is what I'm looking to figure out, I want to see the products that help us actually enjoy the behavior itself more, not all these gimmicks and extrinsic.
While you're asking, so here's a new habit that we're going to form at time. When the person in the audience is asking the question with the microphone, the rest of you who wants to ask the question after that person, while he's asking, raise your hand and I'll point it out. So that way the volunteer over there knows where to bring the mic next. Go ahead and ask your question. Whoever wants to be next, raise your hand.
Thanks, and maybe you can add a little variability.
Maybe we'll call you.
So, my question is actually on role of variability. And do you think, stretching from rats to gerbils to human is really not scientific, in my view? So, because if you look back on most of our habits, outside of the technology, and I'll gladly drop my mobile phone for a smartwatch, to do those things for some other interface, right? But if you look at real habits like toothbrush or drinking tea, which was a big habit in India, right? So these things were formed actually with the consistency and not variability. So if you look at like over time, what thing has really stuck out? Do you think what Googles of the world are experiencing now is kind of a short-term thinking? It's really not the root of how
Yeah.
humans form habits.
So it's interesting. So the question I think is, look, a lot of these habits that we do day in, day out, they're not very variable, right? Drinking my tea is not variable, brushing my teeth is not variable, but it's a habit. But remember here, we're talking about habit change. So what would it take? What does a toothpaste company do when they want you to switch from your existing brand of toothpaste? We all have existing habits, right? We all learn these behaviors very quickly, and the variable reward becomes less and less important when the behavior is codified and becomes part of our day-to-day life. But there's one word that you all know that a manufacturer of a new toothpaste will use when they want you to try that product. What's that three-letter word?
New.
New! Novelty! Something that you've never tried before. That's variability. And so to change these behaviors, to go from something we're not doing to something that we now create a habit with, takes these variable rewards. But over time, I totally agree with you. Over time, when they become things that we do with little or no conscious thought, the variability matters less and less. That's kind of habit design 2.0, right? That's the next phase of the deeper understanding of this model, is that you're right. Over time, once these habits are take hold, it's less important to have the variable reward. But to switch the habits in the first place, variability is very important.
Facebook has been around for some time. And what we are seeing now is many people are opting out of it. And we see that when people buy, but also young people don't want to be there because and that turn on, what was actually like, we are now turned off totally. I know so many people who disconnected totally from Facebook and have sworn that they will not get on. This happens to so many of these social media sites, which is what they is like habit. The viciousness with which we break, right? It means that we never go back to that. So how do you get that population back again? Because most likely that is the population that has the money to spend on the products that they want to advertise.
Right.
It's not the freeloaders.
So habits are replaced over time. When a new solution comes about, it's difficult to do. I mean, for every startup that's tried to take on Facebook, that's modestly successful, we've got Snapchat and Instagram that Facebook bought because they had to, and WhatsApp they bought for $22 billion because it was a competitive threat to their habits. So when products exhibit one or more of these three traits that I talked about earlier, of greater velocity through the hook, greater frequency through the hook, or making the reward more rewarding, the habits change, right? They evolve. These things don't, you can't just create a habit-forming product and rest on your laurels. I think what's happening with Facebook, a big part of it, look, my wife turned off her Facebook. And for her, it was this basic cost-benefit equation that I encourage everyone to do. That I hope this book and my talk doesn't seem like I'm preaching that these products are wonderful and fantastic and we should all use them. Actually, quite the opposite. I'm an advocate for breaking hooks where they don't serve our lives, where they don't help make our lives better, as I am an advocate for making hooks for healthy behaviors. So what my wife did was to look at a product like Facebook and say, look, is this enhancing my life? Is this technology serving me, or am I serving the technology? And for her, she found that there were other platforms that helped her do what she wanted to do. Now, I think these companies, for the most part, do good in the world. They help people stay connected, they give people meaning in their life, they help us interact with each other in ways that I think for a vast majority of people are very beneficial. But part of what makes them awesome also makes them potentially addictive. And so I'm an advocate for breaking hooks in our life. By understanding the deeper psychology of how these products work, we can figure out how we can break these hooks, how we don't want them in our life. So I have all sorts of technologies that I use in my life to help me not use the technologies I don't want to use. For example, I couldn't have written this book without an app called Freedom. Anybody use Freedom by any chance? It's a great little app that all it does, it's the simplest app you can think of. All it does, it's a pre-commitment device. You open the app, you say, here's how much freedom I want. You type in how much time you want to have freedom. You say 90 minutes. And it shuts off your internet. And the only way to turn the internet back on is to reboot your machine. So what does that do? I mean, this thing, seriously, I could not have written this book without it. Because every time I experience this internal trigger of, oh man, this is hard. Writing does not come easy for me. So when I'm stuck in, oh, this is a really hard task, and my association with where do I go to scratch that itch of difficulty, right? This frustration, this anxiety, I go do something brainless. I'll go check the news or Facebook or whatever. Well, now I can't do that. I broke the hook cycle by making the action more difficult. I gotta reboot my whole machine, it's so much work, and I'll just keep writing. And so figuring out how to control these technologies so that they don't control us is very important. I think it's going to become increasingly challenging in our lives, and especially in our kids' life. I think having this skill of knowing how these products hook us so that we can make sure that we're not controlled by these technologies is very important for us.
I put it on TV.
But why not
The freedom can be put on TV.
Okay, you kind of talked about the human touch part of it. With this Internet of Things, where things start talking to things and do things for you, where is that connection? I think you were going in that direction with the breaking the habit part. You see the things talking to things actually breaking some of the habits that you don't need to do.
Can you give me an example?
For example, I don't want to see ads. So these wearables will get rid of them. I don't use this device. So that causes certain behaviors, right? The whole point of an ad. This whole industry is based on that. The monetization is based on that. If I take that away, of course, most people will not allow you to do.
Right.
The industry will break. But if a thing starts doing stuff for you with the other thing, and you cannot send an ad to a thing,
right? So I think actually, a lot of people. Actually, I was just at the demo conference on a panel, and they were talking about what the killer app for wearables will be. Right, so specifically they were talking about smartwatches and Google Glass. I think Google Glass is kind of been dismissed lately, but let's say with the Apple Watch, what's going to be the killer app for and you know what I think the killer app for the Apple Watch is going to be? The time. Like, imagine that. You're going to look at your wrist and you'll see the time. But that's actually a big deal if you think about it, because what happens today when you check the time on your smartphone? You actually check the time on your smartphone? I don't. I see notifications on Facebook and Twitter and email, and I start tapping and clicking to clear those little notifications, and by the time I'm done, I put my phone in the pocket. What's the time again? I have no idea. So in a way, if you think about it, the fact that the interface is now shrinking, and the habits are becoming more important, the fact that we can just turn our wrist and see the time, and we won't be tempted to go to our smartphones anymore and see all these external triggers, actually could help us become less distracted in our day-to-day life. I'm actually quite optimistic. That's an example of how we can we can remove some of the excess triggers in our life that we don't need, that aren't serving us, so that we can just do the things we actually want to do. So I think that's one example. And incidentally, by the way, that also means that it's going to be tougher in this new interface of the watch for companies to trigger us the way they used to on our devices, right? On our big screen laptops and desktops, there was lots of real estate for triggering our behaviors. Right? There was banner ads and this and that and all kinds of triggers. That's kind of going away, which means habits are becoming increasingly important. We know that if you're not an app on that first screen on a mobile phone, good luck. You're going to be part of these apps that are never ever used. They're downloaded, but people just forget about. Why? Because they're not present, right? The trigger is never seen. And now that the interface is going to shrink even further, I think it means that you have to figure out a way to become a habit very, very quickly, or you're going to be forgotten.
Any other questions queued up? Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you one last question. As mentioned, most of the Thai audience tends to be entrepreneurs or waiting. What would be, given all of the experience that you've had, two companies taking them to exit and studying this notion of habit-forming products, what general advice would you give?
Be facilitators. Now, one of the last chapters in the book, I talk about the morality of manipulation. And I give a two-part test for designers to ask themselves where they should allocate their human capital. Right? So, as a VC, you were in the VC, you know this, right? That as a VC, you can allocate your financial capital all over the place. You can have a portfolio of companies. But as an entrepreneur, you can't do that. You only have human capital of one. And so you've got to pick very well what you're going to spend your time and effort on. And so I give this two-part test to help entrepreneurs figure out what's worthy of their time. This short time that we have on Earth, what's worthy of them working on? And so here's my two-part test, and I'm sure I'm going to ruffle some feathers here as well. My two-part test is, number one, can you look yourself in the mirror and answer affirmatively that what you're working on is materially improving people's lives? That's the first test. Is what I'm working on materially improving people's lives? The second question is, am I the user? Am I the user? Now, why am I asking people to ask themselves to build products that they actually use? Oh, anybody here know the first rule of drug dealing? I'm sure you don't. What's the first rule of drug dealing? Anybody know?
Don't use the drug.
Never get high on your own supply. That's the first rule of drug dealing. Never get high on your own supply. So, if you're building a potentially habit-forming product that could be actually addictive, and we didn't talk about addiction, but addiction is not the same as a habit. An addiction is a behavior that always hurts the user and they can't stop. Okay, that's the definition of an addiction, something that is hurtful to the user that they can't stop doing. An addiction is very different from a habit in that a habit is something that we do with little or no conscious thought, but we have good habits and we have bad habits. Addictions are always bad. So if you're building a product that is potentially addictive, by breaking that first rule of drug dealing, by building for yourself, you will know it. So not only are you putting yourself in a good moral position, that if you say to yourself, look, I believe this is materially improved people's lives, and I use the product yourself, that's a good moral position to be. It turns out you also meet the archetype of these very successful companies. That all the companies I mentioned today, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and what, all these companies were started by facilitators, people who were building a product they believe materially improves people's lives, and they themselves were the user. Why is that a competitive advantage? Because you know your user. You are the user. And so that is a huge competitive advantage. Now, many times people don't have the luxury to do that, or they don't want to build for themselves. That's fine, right? You can build a successful company even if you don't meet that quadrant. There's many people who can't answer yes and yes to those two questions and make a lot of money and make successful businesses and help the world. That's great. But I think your highest chance of success and the best moral position to be is to try and be a facilitator.
I think there's actually one more question on this.
Let them go home. They want to leave.
Just one question on the Twitter example. So how much do you credit Twitter for actually putting a power of suggestion and saying tweet and it chirp rather than message or SMS or email? When they created the whole habit for me, people started tweeting. Obviously, nobody went to their website, but whenever they advertised, they never said send a message. They said tweet your friends and tweet your photograph, tweet your presence where you are.
How much of an impact do I think that had? I think there's something easier about, the nature of the tweet, what was different at the time and what was novel at the time, that it was very, very short. So the idea is that it didn't, an email required a lot of work, right? A blog post, oh my God, I got to think of what I need to write, and there were these long paragraphs, well, it tweets 140 characters by design. And so you could argue that it increased people's ability because it was so simple. This necessary constraint made it super easy to send a quick message because there wasn't this expectation that you would get into your thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams. 140 characters, boom, it's easy. And so I think that made it more likely people share through a tweet versus the next best thing, which was at the time.
Thank you. Would everyone please give a nice round of applause?